In the holdings of the Bodleian Library in Oxford, under the archival cipher ms.photogr.d.13, are folders containing yellowed sheets of writing paper, covered in the small handwriting of two English researchers. At first glance, these documents appear to be travel notes. However, detailed paleographic and textological analysis reveals in them the complex structure of an administrative report that became the basis for one of the largest intellectual scandals of the early 20th century. These are the reports of Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, recording the events of August 10, 1901, in the park of the Petit Trianon at Versailles. This corpus of texts, subjected to multiple revisions between 1901 and 1911, is traditionally viewed in the context of paranormal phenomena, but the method of the archaeology of power requires shifting the focus to the institutional environment, the mechanisms of source falsification, and the political context of the era in which these documents were created. Before we proceed to a detailed analysis of the archival materials, protocols, and topographic plans, we ask you to subscribe to our channel to support the development of high-quality historical investigations. Your subscription helps us continue working with primary sources and producing detailed analyses of historical events. To understand the nature of this incident, it is necessary to reconstruct the socio-political and academic hierarchy in which the authors of the reports functioned. Charlotte Ann Moberly was the daughter of George Moberly, Bishop of Salisbury, and held the post of the first principal of St. Hugh's College in Oxford, founded in 1886 to educate women from Anglican families. Her co-author, Eleanor Jourdain, the daughter of a vicar, a doctor of the University of Paris, and a researcher of Dante Alighieri's work, would later assume the post of vice principal of the same institution. The British university system of the late 19th and early 20th centuries imposed the most stringent demands on the academic reputation and moral character of women scholars. Any vulnerability in their rationality or scientific method could be used by conservative Oxford circles to discredit the very idea of higher education for women. Thus, the creation and subsequent publication of the documents under the pseudonyms Elizabeth Morrison and Frances Lamont in 1911 was an act of harsh institutional maneuvering designed to protect the status of St. Hugh's College, while the content of the texts directly concerned the interests of French archival and museum authorities. On the French side, the political landscape of 1901 was characterized by a sharp struggle between the institutions of the Third Republic and the hidden networks of monarchist, neo-legitimist, and clerical factions. In that very year, on July 1, 1901, France adopted the law on associations, which required all closed societies, religious congregations, and orders to undergo official state registration under threat of property confiscation and liquidation. This drove many aristocratic and esoteric circles deep underground, groups that used traditional symbols of pre-revolutionary France as markers of their corporate identity. The Palace of Versailles and its adjacent parks were under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Public Instruction and Fine Arts. In 1892, the position of curator of the National Museum of Versailles was taken by the eminent historian Pierre de Nolhac, who initiated a large-scale restoration program aimed at cleansing the architectural complex of alterations from the eras of Louis Philippe and Napoleon III. Nolhac's goal was to restore the Trianon to the state it was in on the eve of 1789. For this purpose, closed archival research was conducted. Original blueprints by the royal architect Richard Meek were retrieved, and the museum's financial flows were redistributed to favor the recreation of interiors from the era of Marie Antoinette, whose physical suppression in 1793 remained a symbolic point of division in French society. In this atmosphere, Versailles became not merely a tourist site, but a space of ideological confrontation, where every stone and garden path was documented with the precision of court records. Let us turn to the detailed logistics and chronology of events on August 10th, 1901, reconstructed from the personal diaries of the researchers, transport receipts from the Gare Saint-Lazare Railway, and meteorological reports from the Paris Observatory. Moberly and Jourdain arrived at Versailles in the first half of the day. According to the official meteorological bulletin of August 10th, 1901, Paris and its environs recorded an extremely high air temperature, reaching 29 degrees Celsius in the shade, with low barometric pressure and high humidity, indicating the approach of a storm front. Sources note that the researchers used a Baedeker guide from the 1901 edition. However, due to a lack of precise spatial orientation and unfamiliarity with the topography of the park's closed zones, they missed the turn to the Grand Trianon and emerged onto the internal service alleys leading to the Petit Trianon. It was at this moment, according to their initial notes, that they felt a specific physiological state, described by them as a sudden numbness, heaviness, and psychological pressure. Medical reports of that period regularly described such symptoms as a consequence of heat stroke or a sharp drop in atmospheric pressure under conditions of high humidity. The financial reports of the Versailles Museum ticket offices for August 10, 1901, record the sale of 247 tickets to the Trianon grounds, indicating the presence of a significant number of people in the park. According to the corpus of testimonies, the first figures they encountered were two men dressed in long green coats and tricorn hats, whom the Englishwomen took for official servants of the Royal Era Park. During subsequent interrogation by critics and auditors of the Society for Psychical Research in London, it was established that, in the absence of documents confirming an alternative version, these individuals were staff foresters of the Versailles Forestry Service, whose uniform, approved by a ministerial circular of 1895, consisted precisely of green woolen frock coats and formal headwear with cockades of the Third Republic. Moving further along the overgrown alley, Moberly and Jourdain came to a round gazebo, resembling an old kiosk, next to which stood a man whose face was disfigured by smallpox, wrapped in a dark cloak. In the final 1911 publication, the authors identified him as the Comte de Vaudreuil, a close associate of the Queen. However, a critical analysis of the primary sources shows that in the very earliest drafts from November 1901, the description of the smallpox scars and the specific title is absent. These details appeared in the text only after 1904, when Eleanor Jourdain completed her study of Madame Campin's memoirs and familiarized herself with the portrait gallery of the Louis XVI era at the National Library of France. This fact points to the gradual fabrication of eyewitness testimony under the influence of subsequent bibliographic research. Here we encounter the classic phenomenon of textual contamination, where subsequent reading of historical monographs completely reformats the initial recollection of an eyewitness. In paleography, this method is called intertextuality analysis. In the 1901 Moberly manuscript, the figure of a woman sitting on the lawn near the Petit Trianon in a light summer dress and sorting through papers is described as an ordinary visitor or an artist. In the 1906 revision, this figure acquires the features of Marie Antoinette. Mentions appear of details of the dress's cut made of Lyon silk, a specific hairstyle, and a facial expression that precisely copies the portrait by the Swedish artist Adolf Ulrich Wertmüller, exhibited in Versailles. The financial records of the Bodleian Library confirm that in 1903 and 1904, Moberly and Jourdain ordered official copies of archival documents from the collections of the Royal Building Administration for the year 1789. This proves that their report was formed not as a spontaneous recording of what was seen, but as a deliberate academic reconstruction, tailored to the parameters of the archival discoveries of Pierre de Nolhac. They transformed indefinite visual images into concrete historical categories to lend their papers the status of irrefutable documentary evidence. Considering conspiracy theories as one version of the events allows us to address the closed political and cultural processes taking place in Paris at the turn of the century. In 1901, the French capital was the center of activity for the so-called decadent aesthetes, led by Count Robert de Montesquiou Fezensac. This aristocrat, who possessed a colossal fortune, was a key figure in the informal hierarchy of Parisian high society. Montesquieu and his circle, which included representatives of the old nobility, actors from the Comédie Française, and symbolist artists, regularly organized closed costume events, tableaux vivants, and photographic sessions in historical locations. According to internal reports of the Paris Police Prefecture for 1900 to 1902, the police repeatedly recorded cases of unauthorized entry by groups of individuals into closed areas of the Versailles parks in the evening and night hours to conduct theatrical performances in 18th century costumes. Montesquieu used authentic outfits from private collections to recreate the atmosphere of the royal court, which was a form of aesthetic protest against the bourgeois order of the Third Republic. Under the provisions of the 1901 Law on Associations, such gatherings were carefully disguised as ordinary walks or private artist plein-air sessions to avoid persecution by Republican special services. The logistics and methods of conspiracy of the Montesquieu Circle were meticulously developed. For the transportation of costumes and props, private closed carriages were used, following the Paris-Versailles route while bypassing the main checkpoints. Participants met in remote sectors of the park, such as the Belvedere, the Grotto, and the surroundings of the Queen's Hamlet, which in August 1901 were partially closed to the general public due to repair work. The communication system within the circle was built on personal couriers and encrypted notes that used pseudonyms from the court calendar of the time of Louis XVI. The individuals whom Moberly and Jourdain mistook for historical characters were in all likelihood participants in one such rehearsal, or tableau vivant, organized by Montesquieu on August 10, 1901. The man in a cloak by the kiosk and the young man who ran past the researchers, demanding they change their route, were acting within the logic of a closed event, seeking to remove outside witnesses from the territory either rented or illegally occupied by the aristocratic group. The presence of hidden pavilions and the park's dense vegetation allowed the participants of these performances to instantly dismantle the sets and disappear among ordinary tourists upon the approach of the official guards. One must also not ignore the British domestic political context, which left its mark on the structure of the document. In 1901, Britain was experiencing the end of the Victorian era and the accession of Edward VII to the throne. English society saw a growing interest in occultism, spiritualism, and theosophy, expressed in the activities of the Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882. This society included the most prominent intellectuals, including Arthur Balfour and William Crookes. For Moberly and Jourdain, as representatives of Oxford's highest academic stratum, participation in such discourse was a way to integrate into the empire's current intellectual agenda. Yet their report is composed according to all the canons of a judicial inquiry. A clear division into individual testimonies, the compilation of independent chronological tables, and the recording of third-party witness statements. However, it is precisely this excessive methodicalness that betrays the artificial nature of the source. The interrogation protocols conducted by St. Hugh's College's Internal Committee in 1902 show that the authors constantly adjusted the time intervals of their recollections to eliminate logical contradictions. Their goal was to create a legally impeccable dossier that could withstand scrutiny by university auditors. The most important element of the investigation is the cartographic and architectural audit of the area. Moberly and Jourdain claimed that during their walk they saw objects that had been completely eliminated long before 1901. In particular, they described in detail a small wooden footbridge, a bridge over a moat, and a round wooden pavilion they called a kiosk. Given the absence of publicly accessible documents in 1901 confirming the existence of these objects, the authors declared their testimony to be a form of direct contact with the past. However, an audit of archival catalogs conducted by modern researchers shows that the detailed plans by Richard Meek from 1782 and 1783, on which these objects were marked, were not absolutely secret. Copies of these drawings had been published in French archaeological bulletins in 1897 and 1899 as part of reports on the restoration work by Pierre de Nolac. Eleanor Jourdain, who regularly visited Paris to work on her dissertation on French literature, held an official reader's pass to the National Library and the Arsenal Library, where these publications were freely accessible. Thus, the topographical information could have been assimilated by her before August 1901 and subsequently, consciously or subconsciously, integrated into the structure of the report to lend it verifiability. Let us consider the critical audit to which the book An Adventure was subjected after its official publication in 1911. The Committee of the Society for Psychical Research, led by Eleanor Sidgwick and Alice Johnson, conducted a cross-examination of the authors and compared their text with reports from the Versailles administration. As a result of the inspection, a closed SPR memorandum was drawn up, detailing all chronological discrepancies. It was revealed that on August 10, 1901, scheduled work was underway in the gardens of the Petit Trianon to clean the ponds and prune dead branches, involving 12 workers under the supervision of landscape engineer Louis Rousseau. None of these workers recorded the appearance of women in 18th century costumes or any anomalous phenomena. On the contrary, park employees in their explanatory notes stated that they had seen 2 English tourists who looked extremely tired and confused, wandering along paths closed for repairs. Sidgwick pointed out that most of the historical details of clothing of the people encountered, as described by the English women, did not correspond to the actual fashion of 1789, but precisely matched illustrations from popular French novels of the late 19th century, such as the works of Alexandre Dumas père and the historical sketches of Georges Lenotre, which were immensely popular in Oxford at that time. The political consequences of the 1911 publication proved to be quite tangible for the French cultural heritage management system. The scandals surrounding the Trianon ghosts forced the Ministry of Fine Arts to revise the safety and access rules for the Versailles complex territory. The administration of the Third Republic perceived the actions of Montesquieu's circle and the publication by the English researchers as an attempt at the symbolic restoration of monarchical meanings on state territory. A strict ban was introduced on holding any private gatherings, photo sessions, and theatrical performances without the personal approval of the minister, and prior notification to the police prefecture. The financial reports of the Versailles Museum for 1912 record a 15% increase in spending on militarized park security. This led to the definitive cessation of the practice of using state residences as private art spaces for aristocratic circles, dealing a serious blow to the infrastructure of the Parisian counter-revolutionary monarchist underground. The archives of Robert de Montesquiou, partially confiscated by the police in 1913, confirmed that his circle viewed Versailles as a sacred space of true France, opposed to republican degradation, and used historical masquerade as a tool for the political consolidation of Legitimists. Within Oxford itself, the incident led to a hidden institutional crisis, which culminated in a large-scale explosion in 1923, known in university history as the St. Hugh's College Affair. Eleanor Jourdain, who assumed the post of college principal after Moberly's resignation in 1915, introduced a system of strict administrative control, espionage, and demands for absolute oaths of loyalty from the teaching staff. Her management methods were based on a deep conviction in the existence of a large-scale conspiracy against her and her academic legacy, the roots of which she saw in the criticism of the 1911 book. In 1923, this led to the illegal dismissal of one of the leading lecturers, Dr. Cecilia Adey, which provoked a mass protest. All members of the college's academic council and professorship resigned, and the students declared a boycott of lectures. The official university commission, appointed by the Chancellor of Oxford to investigate the situation, conducted a full audit of Jourdain's letters, orders, and financial documents. In the Commission's report, Jourdain's methods were deemed paranoid and inconsistent with the standards of academic law. Unable to withstand administrative pressure and the threat of public removal from office, Jourdain ceased to exist as a result of a heart attack in 1924, a few days before the official university verdict was announced. The documentary epilogue of this story returns us to the analysis of the material traces and archives left by the participants of the events. The complete archive of Moberly and Jourdain, including all intermediate drafts, maps, correspondence with French historians, bills for archival research, and personal diaries, according to Charlotte Moberly's 1937 will, was transferred for permanent storage to the Bodleian Library, where it is accessible under the shelf marks from MS Photogr D1 to D4. These materials clearly demonstrate how, over 30 years, the authors meticulously destroyed any evidence pointing to their initial logistical errors and the facts of borrowing data from printed sources. In the legal spheres of Great Britain and France, this precedent-setting event stimulated the development of stricter standards for historical expertise and source criticism. The method of the archaeology of power allows us to state, the secret of the Trianon ghosts is not a phenomenon of temporal space deformation, but rather the result of a complex interaction of academic ambitions, retroactive document falsification, and the illegal activities of monarchical elites of the early 20th century, who used Versailles as a backdrop for their political and aesthetic manifestos. The documents and blueprints by Richard Meek, confiscated during the reforms of 1913, are now fully digitized and stored in the National Archives of France under the code 011875-1888, providing researchers with the opportunity to personally examine the mechanisms behind the construction of this historical mystification, which is devoid of any mystical foundation, yet deeply rooted in the political struggles of its era.